Good evening, everyone. Tonight we delve into the enchanting tales of Babylon. Sit back, relax, and immerse yourself in the stories of this ancient wonder of the world. If you enjoy our peaceful content, consider subscribing to join us every day. We'd love to hear from you, so make sure to comment and let us know where you're listening in from. Enjoy the journey. The sun rose red over the Euphrates, bleeding into the dusty morning sky like a wound across parchment. Babylon stirred awake with the groaning sounds of labor, merchants calling to each other in the early haze, soldiers changing shifts at the Ishtar gate, and priests beginning their chants at the temples of Marduk. The city, grand and wide, gleamed with baked mud brick towers and the blue-glazed majesty of its sacred walls. It was the heartbeat of an empire, and its pulse was unrelenting. Yet behind the grandeur, a longing lingered like incense in the palace halls. In a high chamber above the ziggurats and walls, Queen Amytis stood barefoot by an open arch, her eyes cast toward the north. Beyond the city's limits stretched the sands and the dry river plains, and further still, invisible beyond the known world, lay the green, sloping lands of Media, her homeland. The queen's black hair, woven with threads of silver and gold, spilled over her white linen robe. A breeze from the river carried a whisper of moisture to her face, but it wasn't enough. Not enough to remember the scent of pine. Not enough to remember the mountain springs where she had once bathed as a girl beneath cypress trees. She had not seen a forest in over a decade. Her husband, Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, ruler of Sumer and Akkad, protector of the temples, loved her in his way. His gifts were many: ivory combs, lapis necklaces, entire caravans brought from the western lands. But none of them gave her what she missed most: green, living, growing. Behind her, soft steps approached. The king's steward bowed low and announced, without raising his head, "His Majesty requests your presence at the Temple of Ninmah, my queen." Amytis turned. "What for?" "He did not say, Majesty, only that it is urgent." She gave one last look at the far horizon before slipping on her sandals. The temple complex was busy with motion. Scribes moved like bees between scroll shelves, their ink-stained fingers fluttering with tablets. Builders passed by with bricks on their backs, chanting to keep their pace steady. The columns of the outer courtyard rose like palms to the sky, supporting tiled ceilings, painted with stars and bulls. In the center stood King Nebuchadnezzar, speaking to an assembly of men and women in long robes. At his right stood a young man, thin but tall, with streaks of river clay up to his knees and eyes that darted like birds from thought to thought. His name was Nabu, named for the god of wisdom, and he was barely 20 years old. "My queen," the king said, stepping forward, "you have inspired a vision." Amytis tilted her head, unsure of his meaning. "A vision?" Nebuchadnezzar smiled broadly. "You miss your mountains, you miss the forests, you miss the cold waters and the clouds that carry rain. I see it in your eyes every day, and it wounds me, though I am the most powerful man in the world." She lowered her gaze. He gestured grandly toward the boy. "This one, Nabu, son of the canal builder of Sippar, has brought me a design. He says he can build a paradise. He says he can make a garden rise from the stones." The queen looked to Nabu, whose face flushed deeply. "I have studied the water-lifting devices of Assyria," he said in a rush. "I have drawn up diagrams to raise water higher than any river would climb on its own. From the Euphrates, into the air, into terraces, into platforms, and from them we can grow anything." Amytis stared. "A garden? Here?" Nabu nodded, his hands shaking with excitement. "Not just a garden, a mountain, suspended in the air, with shade and rivers and songbirds. I've studied the weights and the channels. If your majesty desires it, if the king allows, I can build it." The king beamed. "Let the world remember that Nebuchadnezzar made the desert bloom." Amytis, for a moment, said nothing. Then her fingers reached slowly for her necklace and held the amulet of Ahura Mazda that had always reminded her of home. Then let it be done. The plans began that very evening. Nabu worked by torchlight in the scriptorium. Scrolls unrolled across the floor, clay tablets piled around him like bricks. He calculated water flow, stone weight, arch strength. His fingers bled from carving cuneiform by hand into wet clay. By the second moonrise, he had prepared a scale model. In the middle of the palace compound, an enormous plot was cleared. Buildings demolished, earth excavated. The workers grumbled. It was summer, and the heat punished their backs. But the king spared no expense. Ships brought cedar from Lebanon, stone from the Zagros, and soil, dark and rich, from the Tigris Delta. Slaves and paid builders alike dug foundations as deep as the walls of Babylon were high. The first problem was water. Babylon, though mighty, sat in the sweltering plain of Shinar. Rain was rare. Trees grew only in manicured temple gardens or beside canals. Nabu's plan required vast amounts of water, more than the city's wells could provide. So he turned to the river. He built a massive water wheel, powered by oxen, that scooped Euphrates water up and into a series of spiral channels. From there, the water was led into holding cisterns made of baked brick, sealed with bitumen. Every terrace would have its own reservoir. Every layer would be nourished from below. The second problem was weight. Soil was heavy, trees were heavier. Water was heavier still. Nabu devised a foundation of vaulted stone chambers, layered like the bellies of a pyramid, so the pressure would spread and not crush the lower levels. Arches held it all in place, designed to shift slightly in heat and wind. It had to bend, not break, and above all, it had to be beautiful. By the third month, the first terrace was laid, a broad platform of stone, wide enough to hold a dozen chariots. On it, the queen planted the first saplings, junipers, cypress, and fig. She wept as her fingers touched living green again. Not all approved of the endeavor. In the dark corners of temples, the priests whispered, "Why build a mountain to rival the sacred ones of the gods? The ziggurats were already high enough. Was this not arrogance?" Shara, the high priestess of Ishtar, came before the king with concern. "The people murmur, Majesty," she said. "They say the garden insults the heavens." "The garden is a gift to the queen," Nebuchadnezzar replied. "Then may the gods bless your generosity," Shara said, though her voice held an edge. The workers heard the whispers too, but coin dulled their doubts, and the queen, who once walked silent and pale through the palace, now moved with brightness in her steps. She visited the builders often, asking about their families, bringing jugs of wine on festival days. Some began calling her Mother of Leaves. The name caught on. By the end of the first year, the garden stood 3 terraces tall. It was like nothing the world had seen. Vines hung from high platforms, spilling green like waterfalls. Trees reached upward through open air, their roots hidden in stone coffins filled with earth. Water trickled through channels, carved with lions' heads and bulls' horns. Birds nested in the branches. Even monkeys, brought from distant lands, played in the upper groves. Babylon, mighty and proud, had grown a crown of green upon her head. And yet, the garden was not finished. Nabu, now a hero in the city, saw flaws still. The drainage was imperfect. The stone shifted slightly in the heat. He revised his plans again and again. Perfection was a god's domain, but he aimed close. Amytas walked through the terraces at dusk. She smelled lemon trees and lavender. She heard frogs croak in new ponds and saw fireflies dance in the reeds. But somewhere deep in her heart, she still longed for the mountain breeze of Media. She never said this aloud. Instead, she smiled. She thanked Nabu. She kissed the king. But when she closed her eyes at night, her dreams carried her far away. The garden grew. The legend spread. Travelers from Egypt, Persia, and beyond came to see it. Poets wrote of trees in the sky and mountains floating on brick. Some called it a wonder, others a lie. But none could forget the sight once seen. And somewhere in the shifting silence of midnight, when the moonlight danced on the water trickling through the stone, Nabu sat alone on the lowest terrace, his hands resting in the soil he had raised from dust. He looked up at the stars and whispered, not to the gods, but to the queen. "You wanted a garden. I gave you a world." The morning wind swept gently across the highest terrace of the garden, lifting petals from almond trees and tossing them through the air like soft snow. Amytas sat beneath the shade of a cedar tree imported from the mountains of Lebanon, her sandals beside her on the warm stone, her toes curling in the cool soil. A bird sang from above, a sound so foreign to Babylon's sand-choked skies that for a moment she forgot where she was. But the scent of bitumen from the lower levels and the rumble of oxen turning the massive water wheel at the edge of the canal reminded her. This was not Ecbatana. This was Babylon, the land her father had sworn her into for peace. She had been a queen for 12 years. 12 years in which her homeland grew distant and green in her memory, as Babylon rose taller and hotter around her. Now she sat within an oasis made for her, layered with living memories. But the silence whispered a strange truth. It was not the same. "Mother of Leaves," someone called gently from behind. Amytas turned. A young girl, no more than 13, stood at the edge of the terrace with a basket of figs and herbs. Her robe was stained with green, and her arms were scratched from harvesting. "I picked the first of the spring crop," the girl said proudly. Amytas smiled and stood, brushing soil from her robes. She took the basket and smelled the basil and thyme. "Thank you, child. You've done well." The girl blushed and backed away. "The priests say you dreamed this garden into life." The queen hesitated. "Not quite, but I wished for it so long, perhaps the gods heard." The girl nodded and ran off. Amytas watched her go, her thoughts circling slowly like leaves in the current. She had not asked for a monument. She had not craved a marvel. She had only wept once for the sight of a pine tree. And yet, Nebuchadnezzar had given her this. That afternoon, the king returned from the southern provinces with gifts and reports. His eyes were sunburned, and his beard freshly perfumed with sandalwood. As always, he walked like a man who owned the very stones beneath his feet. "You look younger, my queen," he said as he entered the shaded grove atop the garden's 5th tier. "You must be sunblind," she answered with a small laugh. He embraced her, and for a while, they spoke of crops, taxes, and the tensions with Elam. Then his tone shifted. "I have commissioned a song," he said proudly, "for you, for the garden. The musicians will play it at the festival of Ishtar." Amytas blinked. "A song? Of course. Something to match the beauty of what we've built. Scholars already compare this place to Aratta, to Dilmun. Even the Egyptians, who think themselves gods, have sent scribes to record it." She nodded politely, though inwardly something stirred. The garden had become a spectacle, a beacon of royal glory. Visitors from all nations walked its paths, marveling. But with each footfall, each scroll written, it seemed to belong less to her. At twilight, after the king retired, she climbed to the very top of the garden. The terrace overlooked the entire city. Babylon stretched out beneath her, its towers, its gates, its temples. The Euphrates shimmered like a bronze serpent winding through it all. But beyond that, nothing. The horizon swallowed the world in dust. She whispered to the darkness, "Why is it that when men give you everything, they take something too?" No answer came, but the rustle of fig leaves. Weeks passed. Spring turned to early summer. The garden bloomed in wild colors, pomegranate and jasmine, grapevines tangling with oleander. Bees hovered thick around the hanging blossoms, and water channels gurgled as if singing lullabies. But within the palace, rumors rustled like dry leaves. There was tension in the air. Soldiers murmured about uprisings near the river's southern bends. Temple scribes noted that the gods had grown silent. Some said the garden itself was cursed, that to build heaven on earth was to tempt the gods' jealousy. In the middle of it all, Nabu toiled endlessly. The young architect had grown leaner, his hands thick with calluses. He lived now in a chamber beneath the terraces, where pipes and aqueducts crisscrossed like a city of their own. He checked pressures, angles, root stability. He patched leaks, reinforced columns. One night, the queen visited him. "You work too much," she said, stepping carefully over wet stones and ducking beneath low arches. Nabu looked up, startled. He bowed quickly. "My queen." "No titles here," she interrupted softly. "Just speak." He hesitated. "I am only making sure it lives." Amethyst knelt beside him. "It already lives and breathes. It is more than I ever imagined." Nabu wiped sweat from his brow. "But does it feel like home?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she said at last. "Sometimes it does, but then I catch the scent of tar, or I hear the chant of workers, and it all fades." He nodded. "I've tried to match the climate of Media. I've changed the soil in the upper beds. I've diverted more water during noon heat. But it isn't the same, is it?" "No," she said gently. "It can never be." Nabu looked down at his calloused hands. "Then why continue?" Amethyst stood and touched the stone wall behind her, still warm from the day's sun. "Because we carry our mountains within us," she said, "and sometimes we need to see them outside ourselves, even if only for a little while." Nabu watched her as she left, her steps light, despite the weight of her robe, her figure framed by torchlight like a myth come to life. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sketched a new design, a secret terrace, hidden small, where no foreign envoy would be allowed. No courtiers, no scribes, just her. A place not to impress, but to remember. The garden grew by another tier. This time, the stone was carved with unfamiliar patterns, mountain shapes, deer, hawks, and winding streams. A false mountain to remind the queen of her real one. This terrace bore no symbols of Babylon, no lions or bulls, only her memories, made real. Amethyst found it by accident. She was walking one morning early, when the light had only just begun to touch the tree leaves with gold. She followed a new path, one she hadn't noticed before, and came upon the smallest terrace, a quiet glade surrounded by ash trees, with a low stream running through its center. There was no fountain, no ornament, no guards, just green, and a small stone bench with a single line etched upon it in Median script, to remember what lives in silence. Amethyst sat on the bench, her breath caught in her throat. Around her, the leaves whispered in the wind. No one came, no one disturbed. For the first time since her arrival in Babylon, she cried freely. Elsewhere, far from the garden's peace, the city roiled. The southern provinces were restless. Trade routes along the Tigris were threatened by raiders. Elamite mercenaries refused tribute, and within the palace, younger nobles began questioning the king's endless spending. One night during a royal council, a senator stood and asked bluntly, "How much more gold will be poured into the queen's dream?" The room fell silent. Nebuchadnezzar's voice did not rise. It did not thunder. Instead, it dropped to a quiet tone that carried more weight than fury. "She gave me peace," he said, "a wife from a distant kingdom who bound two nations with her silence. If she asks for a garden that reaches heaven, she will have it." No one spoke again that night, but word spread. The garden was no longer just a marvel. It was a symbol of foreignness, of power, of wealth spent on beauty instead of defense. And slowly, it began to draw. Not only wonder, but envy. Atop the garden, Amethyst continued her walks. She tended herbs herself now, alongside the young girls who had become her acolytes. She taught them the names of plants in Median tongue. She showed them how to prune peach trees and where to place stones for proper shade. To them, she was not just queen. She was a mountain in a foreign land. One day, as she sat with the girls beneath a blooming almond tree, she spoke softly. "Babylon was once a place of chaos. Then men built walls and wrote laws and called it order. But real order comes from life, from knowing when to cut and when to let grow." The girls nodded, unsure of her meaning but loving her voice. That night, alone, Amethyst wrote a letter to her sister in Ecbatana. "The garden rises, but it does not reach the mountain. I have grown roots here, but they are shallow. Still, I water them. Perhaps one day they will find stone." She sealed the letter but never sent it. Some things she knew belonged only to the earth. By the third year of its creation, the garden had grown taller than the palace walls. Its highest terraces now brushed the heavens, visible even from the outskirts of Babylon. Travelers who approached the city along the western road often stopped and stared, disbelieving what rose before them. Where once had been dust and heat, now loomed a mountain of life, green, alive, and moving in the wind. But the foundation of such wonder was not only made of stone, it was made of sweat, pain, and a quiet, forgotten brilliance. At the base of the structure, where the roots of the garden were literal and metaphorical, a labyrinth of vaulted arches held the weight of paradise above. There, in the cool darkness, stone breathed. And Nabu walked alone among it. The young engineer, now older and hardened by time, ducked beneath a newly constructed aqueduct and stepped carefully over water channels snaking between massive support columns. The air was damp, with the scent of moss and ancient earth, and the only light came from oil lamps hanging on iron hooks. Shadows flickered along the ceiling, dancing like spirits. He moved slowly, touching walls as he passed them. They were alive to him. Not literally, of course, but in the way that mattered. These stones bore the weight of trees, of soil, of entire worlds above them. And if they cracked, the illusion above would crumble. He reached a spot, marked with charcoal, 3 slanted lines forming a warning. The mortar had begun to flake. A fine crack split the arch's keystone. Nabu sighed. Again. Behind him, an assistant approached. Kalamu, a bright boy with the energy of youth and the hunger for knowledge, carried a basket of tools and a tablet with sketches. "I brought what you asked for, Master," he said. Nabu turned. "We'll need more cedar wedges, and bring lime from the southern yard." Kalamu nodded and sprinted off. The crack was not catastrophic yet, but it was growing, and the pressure from above had increased with the new tier. The garden was reaching limits the earth had not intended. Nabu knelt and ran his fingers along the crack. He knew every inch of this structure, He had designed each vault, each weight-bearing line, but the world changed. The wind shifted, the river rose, and the sun baked everything in its reach. He had made a mountain in the sky, but now the mountain was fighting back. While Nabu labored below, the garden above celebrated its latest triumph. The sixth terrace was open to the public, a series of broad plazas shaded by olive trees and draped with grapevines. Statues of lions carved from alabaster guarded the corners. Small pools reflected the sky, and musicians played stringed instruments while dancers performed beneath the shade. The royal court gathered in fine linen and perfumed cloaks. Nobles from Assur and Susa walked the paths, their eyes wide with wonder. Poets composed verses on the spot, speaking of heaven-made stone, of roots that defied gravity. Amethyst moved among them like a ghost of grace. She smiled. She nodded. But her heart was elsewhere. She remembered the day Nabu had first shown her the garden's skeleton. Bare, dusty stone, and open air. Now she could barely see the structure beneath the life it carried, and that worried her. Later, she found Nabu resting beside a column on the third terrace, his face smudged with ash and his robe torn at the edge. "You weren't at the celebration," she said. Nabu looked up. "There's a crack forming beneath the sixth vault. I'll need more cedar and lime." Her brows furrowed. "Is it dangerous?" "Not yet, but the weight is increasing, more than I expected. The trees are older now, the soil denser, the water heavier. Every drop adds strain." She knelt beside him. "Will it hold?" "It has to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you ever regret building it?" Nabu didn't answer right away. He leaned his head back against the warm stone. "I built it for you," he said at last, "and in doing so, I built it for the king, for the city, for every traveler who will carry tales of it to distant lands. But sometimes I wonder if I've trapped myself inside it." Amethyst looked at him closely. "You mean the work?" "I mean the garden itself," he said. "It was supposed to be a dream, but dreams are weightless. This is not." She touched the stone beside him. "Even dreams need walls to live in." At the outer edges of the garden, a new kind of work had begun. Nabu, ever cautious, had ordered a second support system, hidden beneath the first. He had devised a new technique, double arches, staggered, with hollow channels that absorbed shock. It was expensive. It slowed the work. But he insisted. Some called it madness, others genius. In the cool of the morning, workers hauled stone blocks into place while engineers shouted measurements and orders. The garden never slept. It needed tending, day and night. Among the workers was a man named Tarun, once a soldier, now turned laborer after an injury ended his career. He hated the garden. To him, it was a monument to vanity, a mountain built not by gods, but by kings who believed themselves divine. He swung his hammer with precision, but his eyes burned with resentment. "You know what I think," he said to another worker one afternoon. "This garden will fall, not today, not tomorrow, but one day, and it'll crush everything under it, because it was built on pride." The other man said nothing. Tarun wiped sweat from his brow. "We're not meant to build the sky." Elsewhere, in the temple district, the priests of Ishtar gathered. Shara, the high priestess, had grown wary. She had seen the garden become more than a gift. It had become a shrine, not to the gods, but to mortal ambition. She stood before the altar and spoke to her acolytes. "There is a place for green things. There is a place for beauty. But when men build Eden with their own hands, they forget the serpent always follows." One of her followers, a sharp-eyed scribe named Kidratu, took notes on everything she said. He was fascinated not only by the rituals of the temple, but by the politics of the court, and the garden had become the fulcrum of both. Later that night, Kidratu visited the public archives. He read old maps, old construction ledgers. He traced changes in the city's water usage. He found, buried in a forgotten scroll, mention of a diverted canal rerouted to feed the garden's cisterns. And in another scroll, one meant for royal eyes only, he found a warning written in Nabu's own hand. Weight beyond design limits. Potential collapse under long-term load. Emergency reinforcements advised. Kidratu's hand trembled slightly. He understood what this meant. The garden, beautiful and proud, carried its own death within it. And still, it bloomed. Birds nested in the fig trees. Children played in the shallows of the upper pools. The Queen's secret terrace, though hidden, had become her sanctuary. There she wrote poems in the Median tongue, folded them into petals, and let them float down the streams. One such petal found its way down to the third terrace, where Nabu found it resting near a drain. He opened it carefully. It read, "Stones carry more than weight. They carry wishes." He read it 3 times, and then he smiled. As midsummer approached, the heat grew oppressive. The oxen at the water wheel collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced by a system of pulleys and laborers. The canals ran slower, the water grew warmer, and one night, as lightning danced on the far horizon and thunder rumbled like the roar of a lion, a tremor struck the city. It was small, but sharp. In the depths beneath the garden, one of the lower arches cracked. Not a hairline, not a scratch, a real fracture, jagged, wide enough to see daylight. The alarm was raised. Nabu was summoned from his chambers. Soldiers cleared the garden. Torches lit the night. And Nabu stood in the darkness beneath the structure he had built, staring at a wound in his creation. He did not panic. He ordered supports, wedges, counterweight adjustments. He knew what to do. But in his chest, something cold bloomed. The garden had begun to resist its maker. It was no longer just stone and design. It had become a creature of its own, a breathing thing made of wood and water and dreams. And now, it demanded sacrifice. Above, Amethyst stood on the upper terrace, watching the chaos below. She placed a hand on the nearest tree, feeling its bark beneath her fingers, and she whispered, "Hold fast." The Euphrates shimmered under the early morning sun, its wide, sluggish current winding like a serpent through the cradle of Mesopotamia. Along its edges, reeds danced in the breeze, their shadows casting broken patterns over the water. Fishermen tossed their nets, unaware that just beyond the river's bend, the king's greatest marvel groaned beneath its weight. Atop the hanging gardens, the terraces were quieter than usual. The birds had not yet returned, and the water in the upper pools lay still, silent, reflective, as though mourning. The garden's breadth was shallow. Below the stone canopy, in the vaulted galleries where light never reached, the cracked arch had been temporarily reinforced. Nabu stood beneath it now, studying the repair with a sculptor's focus. His hands, caked with lime and dust, gripped the rough column as though it could speak to him. His eyes scanned the new bracings, looking not just at them, but through them, searching for hidden tremors. Behind him, Kalamu approached with a cautious step. "We've doubled the cedar beams as ordered, Master. The crack has not widened." Nabu didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, listening. The walls echoed, the soft drip of moisture from unseen corners. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times. Today it struck him differently, like the ticking of a clock. "It won't hold forever," he said softly. Kalamu's voice wavered. "Then what must we do?" "We must make the river flow uphill." For centuries, the Babylonians had bent water to their will. They had carved canals through deserts, dug trenches that swallowed floodwaters, and created artificial lakes from dust. But what Nabu proposed now was something else entirely. He stood before the court later that day, his hands shaking slightly as he unrolled a scroll of fresh plans across the floor of the Great Hall. Ink drawings marked a new network of devices arranged in layers along the city's northern canals. "We must build a new system," Nabu explained. "Not one wheel, but 5, each feeding the next, powered not only by oxen, but by men, wind, and gravity." King Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward. "A chain of lifters?" "Yes," Nabu said, "using the Archimedean spiral model learned from Alexandria and adapted for our terrain. We will lift water to the highest terrace without relying on beasts alone." One of the generals scoffed. "You'll drain the Euphrates for a garden." Nabu turned to him, his voice sharper than usual. "We drain it already, but this time it will flow with purpose, with control." Amita sat quietly to one side of the hall. She said nothing, but her eyes never left Nabu's face. Shara, the high priestess of Ishtar, raised a cautionary hand. "Even the gods cannot reverse the river. Be careful, architect." Nabu bowed, though his expression remained cold. "With respect, Holy One, we no longer live in the age of myth. The gods gave us hands. Now we must use them." Nebuchadnezzar slammed his staff to the stone. "Build it." The new lifters began construction the next morning. In the dust beyond the northern canal, 1,000 men were summoned to dig trenches, set foundations, and forge bronze screws taller than 2 men. Giant gears were carved from ashwood. Levers were set into concrete beds reinforced with stone and lime. It was engineering on a scale even Babylon had never seen. Nabu was everywhere at once, inspecting the torque of pulleys, the angle of spiral blades, the flow rate of channels. He slept only a few hours a night, often falling asleep with a tablet in his lap and ink drying on his hands. Amytas visited the site once. She wore a plain robe and walked barefoot across the dusty field, unnoticed until she stood beside Nabu as he tested the first of the bronze spirals. "You really believe you can make water rise like a bird into the sky?" she asked. Nabu smiled faintly. "Water seeks its own level, but with enough patience, it will follow us anywhere." She watched the spiral turn, slowly, deliberately, and saw water begin to crawl upward through the tube. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if all this is too much? If the garden was meant to be smaller? Simpler?" "All the time," Nabu said. "But you keep building." He nodded. "Because if I stop, it will fall." In the temple, Shara grew restless. She had watched the garden grow like a vine, wrapping itself around the soul of the city. Now the river itself was being rerouted, lifted, and drained. The priests murmured that the gods were being replaced by tools, and tools, they said, had no mercy. One night, Shara summoned Kidratu to her inner sanctum. "You've been studying the records," she said. "Tell me what the city has sacrificed for this garden." Kidratu unrolled a scroll. "The new water wheels divert nearly 1/3 of the river's flow. The farmers west of the city report dry canals. Fish markets have shrunk. Trade barges move slower." Shara's lips pressed thin. "And the people? They admire the garden," Kidratu said, "but in the alleys they whisper that it drinks too deeply." Shara stood slowly. "Then the time has come to offer the queen a choice." Amytas received the priestess in her private chamber 2 days later. They sat in silence first. No guards, no courtiers, just 2 women, each worn by time in different ways. "You came to accuse me," Amytas said at last. I came to speak truth, Shara replied. Your garden is beautiful, but its roots have grown too deep. They pierce the city's heart. Even the gods must breathe, Queen, and this garden steals the sky. Amytis closed her eyes. It was never meant to be this. But it is, Shara said. You must ask your husband to limit the growth. Let it live, but do not let it consume. Amytis turned to the window, looking out at the distant spiral lifts, now turning endlessly under the desert sun. I will try, she said. That night, Amytis found Nebuchadnezzar in his study, poring over reports. She waited until he noticed her. He smiled and gestured for wine, but she raised her hand. We need to talk about the garden. He paused. What about it? It has grown too large. It drains the city. The priests say it defies the gods. The people whisper. The rivers run thin. He looked at her, not angry, but puzzled. You love the garden. I love what it represents, she said. But when a symbol becomes a burden, even love can be cruel. He rose and walked to the window. I built it for you. I know, she whispered. And now you ask me to stop. She touched his arm. Not stop. Balance. For a moment, the king was silent. Then he said, let the final terrace be the last. Amytis exhaled slowly. It was a compromise, but in her heart, she felt the wind shift. By the end of the 5th month, the lifters were complete. Water now flowed in an elegant chain of motion, rising tier by tier, flowing over stone basins, whispering through carved sluices. The hanging gardens drank deeply, but efficiently. The burden on the oxen lessened. The rhythm of Babylon began to stabilize. But below, in the foundations, the oldest stones continued to strain. Nabu walked the arches again, marking each tremor, each sign of pressure. He placed prayer beads along the support columns, not out of faith, but as markers. If one fell, he would know. He carried with him now a second scroll, his final contingency plan. If the garden showed signs of full collapse, he would flood the lower chambers. Let the water absorb the fall. He never showed it to anyone, not even Amytis, because he knew there was no turning back. The river had been reversed. Now, so had fate. From the highest terrace of the Hanging Gardens, the world seemed small. Below, the city of Babylon unfolded in perfect geometry, walls like veins, canals like arteries, buildings like the bones of some ancient giant. The blue-glazed gates shimmered in the distance. The rooftops of temples blazed in the sun, and the copper spire of the great ziggurat pierced the sky like the finger of Marduk himself. But from the garden's peak, all of it faded behind walls of trees, fountains, and vines suspended in open air. Up here, life bloomed unnaturally, not by the will of the gods, nor by nature's slow hand, but by human ambition. Cypresses stood firm in raised coffins of carved stone. Vines from distant lands climbed columns older than memory. Orchids clung to bricks like parasites. The very roots of this place had no earth to grow in, only design and desire. It was, Nabu often thought, a miracle built on scaffolding. He stood now at the central basin of the top tier, overseeing the planting of a new pomegranate grove. The workers moved carefully, carrying saplings with exposed roots wrapped in damp cloths. Around them, water flowed from a newly constructed spillway, circulating in soft spirals designed to mimic the currents of natural streams. One of the younger laborers, his skin dark from the sun, looked up from the roots he was placing into the soil and asked, "How do these trees survive, Master? With no true ground beneath them?" Nabu knelt beside him. "Because we built a false earth beneath them," he replied, "a world made of layers. Below your hands is a basin of stone and lime. Below that, a drainage bed of broken potsherds. Beneath that, a shell of bitumen to trap the water. And beneath all that, columns and arches like the bones of a giant. The boy looked confused. So it is not real? It is real, Nabu said, but not natural. That is the price of beauty this high. The boy nodded and returned to his work. Nabu stood, shading his eyes, as he looked toward the horizon. The wind blew from the north, dry and hot, rustling the treetops. Already he could see signs of stress, the outermost leaves of the citrus trees curling in response to the sun, the exposed soil turning pale. The balance was delicate. The weight above had to be countered by lightness in the soil. Too much moisture, and the vaults below would crack. Too little, and the trees would die. He carried the entire structure in his head, every tier, every wall, every channel. He felt the garden's heartbeat through vibrations in the stone, and lately, that rhythm had begun to skip. In the Queen's secluded glade, Amethyst walked alone. The birdsong was faint today. The bees had gone quiet. She brushed her fingers over the lavender stalks, breathing in the sharp scent, and paused at the edge of the terrace. A single fig tree stood here, twisted and gnarled, planted by her own hand 5 years ago. It had grown well, its branches now stretched over the parapet like arms reaching for the desert wind. But today, it drooped. Its leaves were dusty. Its trunk leaned slightly. She knelt, pressed her palm into the soil, and felt warmth, but too much of it. The earth was dry beneath the surface. She rose and walked to the upper aqueduct, tracing the flow of water. It ran thinner than usual. She followed it farther, up the steps to the main terrace, where she found Nabu already at work, with a team of apprentices adjusting sluices and patching stone channels. "Nabu," she called. He turned, his hands muddy, his brow streaked with soot. "Your Majesty," she gestured back toward her glade. "The water doesn't reach the lowest basin. The fig tree suffers." He nodded. "The wind has shifted. The air's grown drier. The western lift wheel seized last night. We're diverting water manually while we make repairs." "Will it last?" Nabu hesitated. "Yes, for now." She studied him, and later, he met her gaze. "We've created a heaven, but heavens require constant tending. One failure, one day of inattention, and it all falls." Amethyst stepped forward and lowered her voice. "How long can you hold it?" Nabu exhaled slowly. "As long as I must." They stood in silence, surrounded by stone and sky. Then she asked, "Do you think the roots will ever reach the real earth?" He looked at the terrace beneath their feet. These roots were never meant to. Their only soil is faith. Elsewhere, Kidratu watched from the shadows. The royal scribe had taken a habit of walking the garden's edges, observing without being seen. He carried a thin tablet at all times, recording not just the garden's condition, but its people, its laborers, its engineers, its caretakers. He was no longer just a scribe. He was a seeker of truth, and the truth he had come to realize was more complex than myth. In the archives, he had uncovered a sealed tablet, forgotten under layers of tax records. It contained Nabu's earliest calculations, weight distribution, aqueduct capacity, root strain predictions. It also contained a warning. The final tier, if built, must be limited to saplings and vines. Anything heavier risks compromise of the vault below. But the terrace now held full trees. Kidratu closed the tablet and looked up at the pomegranate grove being planted above. The red fruits would be heavy, the soil was thick, and below it all was the final vault, untested, unsupported, too shallow. He walked the garden in a daze, the beauty around him now veined with fear. And as he passed a group of children laughing in the lower fountains, he made a quiet vow. If this wonder was doomed to fall, someone must remember it truly, not as a myth, but as it was. That evening, as the sun bled across the desert sky, Amethyst returned to her secret terrace. The fig tree still stood, struggling. She brought with her a clay jar of water, carried in both hands, and poured it gently at the base of the tree. As the roots drank, she whispered softly in the Median tongue, words of comfort once used by her mother when tending roses in the high valleys of Ecbatana. The stone beneath her was warm. The leaves above her stirred. Then footsteps. She turned to see Shara, the high priestess, standing at the entrance to the glade. "I was not summoned," Shara said quietly, "but I come with warning." Amethyst stood. "You're always welcome here." "The garden rises," Shara said, "but it leans. The city watches it not with wonder, but with worry. They whisper it grows taller than our gods." Amethyst smiled sadly. "Do they not understand? It was never meant to be a temple, only a gift." Shara stepped forward, placing a hand on the tree. "Then let it be tended, not praised, not worshipped. Do not let this place become a monument to forgetting." Amethyst looked down at her hands, now stained with soil. "I remember everything." Shara nodded. "Then let it be so." Days passed. The garden remained quiet. The repair to the western water wheel succeeded. The aqueducts flowed again. The fig tree revived. The air cooled slightly, but Nabu did not sleep. He had begun charting micro-movements in the terrace slabs. Every 2 hours he walked the arches, placing tiny reed markers in cracks. He measured their shift, down to the width of a grain of barley. The movement was slow, but steady. And then, one night, he noticed something that turned his blood cold. The central basin, anchor of the entire top terrace, had begun to sink. Only slightly, a hand's width, but enough. He summoned Kalamu and his senior apprentices. "We must begin reinforcement immediately," he said. "Drain the central basin, shift the water load to the eastern cistern. I'll prepare stone braces for the vault beneath." Kalamu's face blanched. "Do we tell the king?" Nabu shook his head. "Not yet. Let us fix the damage before it becomes prophecy." The work began in silence, under torchlight. Atop the terrace, roots dangled into voids once hidden. The sky watched. And in the night, far from the sound of water and stone, Kidratu sat by lamplight, writing. He titled the clay tablet, Chronicle of the Garden. And he began. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar, a mountain rose in the sky, built not of earth, but of yearning, fed not by rain, but by men who reversed rivers. A marvel, yes, but not without cost. For every root that reached the heavens, a crack opened below. And so it was, beauty, weight, and breath, suspended by the hands of those who dared to dream beyond the soil. He paused, and then continued writing through the night. The sound of dripping water echoed through the stone hollows like the heartbeat of something sleeping, ancient, heavy, and restless. Beneath the sixth terrace of the hanging gardens, Nabu crouched in the dim torchlight, watching as a single droplet formed at the mouth of a hairline crack and fell into a growing puddle below. The splash was soft, almost innocent, but Nabu knew what it meant. The basin above, drained last week to relieve the weight, had begun to sink again. He had watched the slabs shift under his fingers. He had measured the angle of stress on the vault supports and listened to the tremors whisper through the stonework. This garden was no longer merely rising, it was straining. A marvel, yes. But even marvels grow tired. Behind him, Kalamu approached, careful not to disturb the water trail. "We've braced the basin's southern edge," the young assistant whispered, "but the joints aren't holding. They were never meant for such strain." Nabu didn't move. "I know." "We can install steel rods," Kalamu offered. "Maybe chain supports through the third-tier arches." "No," Nabu cut in. "Too much drilling will only open more fractures." He stood, wiping dust from his hands. His bones ached. His breath was shallow. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. "Tell the Queen I want to see her," he said. "Tonight, in the glade." That evening, Amatus walked the silent garden alone. The trees no longer rustled with confidence. There was tension in the air, like a violin string drawn too tight. The wind smelled faintly of dust and copper, a scent that did not belong in paradise. She entered the secret glade. The fig tree was blooming again, its green leaves a small victory against the dying season. She sat beneath it, and Nabu stepped from the shadows. His face looked older, thinner, drawn, shadowed beneath his eyes. He sat beside her without ceremony. For a while they said nothing. Then, "How bad is it?" she asked. He answered without looking at her. "The central basin is sinking, slowly, but steadily. The vault beneath it may not last another year." Amytas nodded once. No tears, no gasp, just understanding. "I always knew it would one day fall," she whispered. Nabu looked at her, startled. "Why?" "Because nothing living is meant to stay above the sky forever." He lowered his gaze. "We can reinforce it again. It might hold, but each change adds weight. Each fix creates new cracks. We are delaying the inevitable." She leaned her head back against the tree. "Do you regret it?" "No," he said instantly, "but I think I regret how much it's taken from us." She reached for a fig above them, gently twisting it from its stem, then placed it in his hand. "Even if it ends tomorrow," she said, "this fruit exists. That is enough." "Do." In the royal palace, King Nebuchadnezzar prepared for war. To the east, Elamite raiders had begun pressing into border towns. To the north, alliances frayed. Traders from Nineveh spoke of rebellion. The great balance of his kingdom, so carefully maintained, had begun to sway, just as the garden did. He spent his days in armor and his nights in prayer. But the priests now looked elsewhere. Shara, high priestess of Ishtar, had not entered the garden in weeks. She gave sermons warning against the sins of pride and unnatural ambition. Her followers multiplied. They walked the streets in blue robes, singing of the flood that once cleansed the world. Some whispered the garden's collapse would be divine judgment. The city began to hold its breath. Children stopped playing in the lower fountains. Workers grew quiet. Musicians in the upper terraces tuned their instruments in silence, performing only when summoned. The laughter that had once filled the air now echoed like memory. Even the birds had grown fewer. One night, under torchlight, Nabu summoned Kidratu. He brought him deep beneath the garden, into the lowest vault chamber, a space no outsider had ever seen. There, ancient beams groaned above a floor of limestone and soot. The pillars here were scarred. The air was thick and warm, like breath trapped for centuries. "I want you to write what you see," Nabu said. Kidratu looked around. "What is this place?" "The base," Nabu replied, "the root of the entire garden." Kidratu opened his scroll. "Why me?" "Because you understand what stories are for," Nabu said. "Not to glorify, but to remember." He touched a beam, his fingers lingering on its cracks. "This," he said softly, "is the cost of holding heaven." By mid-autumn, news of structural decay began to leak beyond the palace. Merchants spoke of closed terraces. Nobles grumbled that their visits were restricted. Scribes noticed changes in water rationing, and engineers, once proud to show their designs, now spoke only in hushed tones. Whispers became rumor. Rumors became fear. And yet the garden still stood. From a distance, it looked unchanged, verdant, vast, divine. Visitors still arrived, eyes wide with wonder. Pilgrims climbed the steps, touching stone and weeping. No one saw the steel rods hidden in walls, the lime reinforcements behind flower beds, the fresh hairline fractures masked by vines. Nabu had worked tirelessly to hide the wounds, because once people saw the garden bleeding, they would only remember the fall. Amethyst stood once more on the top terrace, alone. The basin was empty now. Its water had been rerouted to reduce pressure. The soil had dried, and she could see lines in the stone that were not there before. Below, the whole city glittered in sunset. For a moment, she imagined the view from her childhood. Mountains, sharp and cold, their peaks bright with snow. And she whispered to the wind, "I remember." Then with bare hands, she began digging. Not much, just a hole in the softest part of the terrace, a patch of soil near the empty basin. She dug until her fingers were raw. Then she pulled from her robe a small seed wrapped in cloth. She planted it, watered it with a clay cup, and stood. "If this place falls," she said aloud, "let something rise again." Nabu watched from the shadows, saying nothing. But that night, he sketched a final design. Not for reinforcement, but for collapse. Not in panic, but in grace. A sequence of controlled demolition. Should the vaults crack beyond repair, the top terraces would fall inward, not outward. They would bury themselves, preserving what they could, sparing the city below. A final gift to the queen. In the king's chamber, Nebuchadnezzar gazed at the stars. He had once ruled the world. Now even his greatest triumph stood on trembling legs. He summoned Amethyst. When she entered, they did not speak of war, nor of the garden, nor of gods. He simply said, "If it falls, they will remember you." She smiled. "If it falls, they will remember us." And so the kingdom hung, suspended, not in death, not in ruin, but in breath, in tension, in that space between triumph and fragility, between what was and what might still be. In the highest terrace of the Hanging Gardens, a fig tree bore fruit beneath an empty sky, and beneath it, in the soil no deeper than a hand's span, a seed slept, waiting. Wind has no shape, no master, no memory, yet it remembers everything. It moves through the alleys of Babylon, whispering stories that stone tries to forget. It curls around the ziggurat, rushes over the Ishtar gate, and climbs the terraces of the Hanging Gardens with invisible fingers. And on this particular morning, the wind was restless. It pulled at the vines on the lower terraces. It scattered petals into the canals and carried dust onto the polished bricks. It sang low through the stone arches beneath the sixth terrace, where the oldest cracks had grown like veins under skin. Nabu stood near one such crack, placing a reed marker into the wall, watching it shiver ever so slightly with the wind. "We sealed this last month," Kalamu said beside him, nervous. "There was no shift since." "There wasn't," Nabu replied, "until the wind returned." They both turned their gaze upward, toward the open sky above the vaults, where trees swayed. A gust passed through the garden, not violent, but long and unbroken, like breath held too long and finally released. "You feel it?" Nabu asked. Kalamu nodded slowly. "It's pressing down." Wind, a force unseen but unstoppable. And in this garden, suspended high above the natural world, it pressed not just on leaves, but on balance, on tension, on the boundary between miracle and collapse. On the third terrace, Amethyst walked barefoot along a narrow stone path between pools. The scent of jasmine hung in the air. A few birds fluttered past, disturbed by the strange weather. She paused beneath a tall date palm and looked up. The sky was an odd color today, a yellowish gray, not clouded, not clear. Dust from the northern plains carried on the air, staining the light. It felt like the world was holding its breath again. Behind her, the sound of sandals on stone. She turned to find Kidratu, the scribe, approaching with a tablet in his hands. "I apologize, my queen," he said, bowing, "but there is something I must share with you." She gestured for him to walk with her. Together, they moved along the terrace as he unrolled a fresh scroll. "Master Nabu has begun recording final contingency measures," he said softly. "Collapse plans, controlled descent structures. He's drawing ways to let the garden fall safely." Amethyst stopped walking. "And he didn't tell me." "I do not believe it was meant as secrecy, my queen," Kidratu said gently. "But mercy." She closed her eyes. "Even the strongest stone breaks under silence." Then she took the scroll from him. She read it carefully. Each diagram showed how the top terraces could be isolated, how soil could be released in stages, how water channels could be drained to shift weight. It was not destruction, it was preservation. It was Nabu's final devotion. "He knows the end is near," she said quietly. "He knows it must not be violent," Kidratu added. Amethyst rolled up the scroll, held it to her chest, and said only, "Then we shall speak openly." That night, under torchlight, she met Nabu on the upper terrace. He stood near the basin, inspecting a new fault line in the central slab. His fingers ran over the rough edges, like a surgeon reading the body of a failing patient. "You weren't going to tell me," Amethyst said without greeting. He turned, startled. "I was going to wait," he said, "until I had hope again." She handed him the scroll. "You've already written the fall." He took it slowly, his fingers brushing hers. "It's only a precaution." "Is it?" He didn't answer. The wind blew again, harder now. The basin walls creaked faintly. A single fig dropped from a branch and rolled across the stones. "Why did you stay?" Amethyst asked suddenly. "You could have left years ago. You finished the garden. You built what no man ever has." Nabu looked out over the garden. "Because I never finished it," he said. "It never stops. It never breathes without me." She stepped beside him. "Then let it breathe, even if it's for the last time." In the royal hall, Nebuchadnezzar studied war maps. Reports from the borders spoke of a Syrian movement. Traders from Uruk carried news of tensions with Egypt. The world below Babylon stirred with unrest. And now, even the wind betrayed him. The high priestess Shara entered unannounced. Her robes rippled as though she brought the storm inside with her. "You must close the garden," she said bluntly. The king raised an eyebrow. "You speak of paradise." "I speak of illusion," Shara said. "It rises too high. It casts shadows over our temples, over our gods." He laughed bitterly. "I built it for a goddess." "No," Shara said, stepping closer. "You built it for love. And love, when left unchecked, becomes obsession." The king stood. "You will not curse my wife's legacy." "I do not curse her," Shara replied, voice softening. "But you must listen. Collapse is coming. The wind speaks louder than we do. You must prepare the people." Nebuchadnezzar turned to the window. From this height, he could see the top terrace. The trees moved unnaturally. The entire garden looked as if it were shifting. Breathing, yes, but also trembling. "Tell them," Shara said, "so they do not mistake a fall for the wrath of the heavens." The following day, a proclamation was issued. Access to the upper terraces shall be limited. Maintenance of the hanging gardens will continue. Citizens are to remain calm. The garden is under divine restoration. Some believed it, most did not. Workers whispered of vaults bending. Merchants claimed they saw dust fall from the high stones. One boy swore he heard the trees crying. Still the city carried on. Babylon was too proud to tremble, too ancient to flinch. But the wind knew. It curled around the hanging staircases. It hissed through the temple doorways. It ran its invisible hands through the palm fronds and told them secrets. And the stone listened. Nabu spent his days reinforcing the vaults and his nights writing letters to future engineers, to distant cities, to whoever might find the ruins one day. He wrote instructions. He wrote confessions. He wrote most of all that this was not madness, but love. Then, on a day when the sky turned copper and the wind howled low and constant, the crack in the basin burst open. It happened without warning. A deep groan, a sharp snap, and then the sound of water pouring down through stone like the scream of the earth itself. Kalamu ran into the workshop, breathless. The basin's failing. Nabu stood calmly. We move now. The fall had begun. Controlled descent was never just a theory. It was a ritual. Engineers and workers sprang into action, pulling floodgates, breaking pre-scored stone walls, redirecting water, dismantling vines, draining pools. Every action was a choice. Sacrifice this terrace to preserve that arch. Cut this tree to relieve that weight. Amita stood on her private terrace, watching it all unfold. She clutched her robe as the fig tree shuddered in the wind. Behind her, Kidratu appeared. I've sent word to the temple scribes, he said. They'll record everything. Good, she whispered. Let them write the truth. He paused. What is the truth, my queen? She looked up at the sky. That even the gods envy beauty built by hands. Stone fell that night, not in ruin, but in surrender. The uppermost terrace collapsed inward, into the drained basin below. It crushed trees, shattered fountains, split aqueducts, but it did not fall outward. No towers toppled into the city. No walls burst. The garden folded like a dying flower, petals drawing inward in one last act of grace. The wind howled in mourning, but the city stood, and so did the people. And in the center of it all, among the cracked stones and ruined walkways, a single sapling remained untouched. Planted in secret, watered by hand, it would grow, not to reach the sky, but to remember it. Babylon awoke to silence. No birdsong, no laughter from children in the lower pools, no hum of distant fountains. The usual murmur of flowing water and footsteps above had ceased. Only the wind remained, brushing softly against the stone, almost afraid to be loud now. It had happened in the night, not with fire or thunder, not with the rage of gods, but with gravity and time. The hanging gardens, once a tapestry of color woven high above the desert floor, had folded in on itself, like a scroll being rolled at the end of a story. And the city felt it. Merchants opened their stalls with subdued movements. Fishermen cast nets into the Euphrates with dull, mechanical motions. Priests burned incense, though their prayers felt strangely hollow. The great gates of Babylon still stood. The palace walls still gleamed. But something had broken, even if it had not shattered. The garden, the dream, was gone. At least that's what the people believed. But beneath the stone and silence, within the fractured terraces and broken vaults, something still lived, and Amytis knew it. She stood at dawn among the rubble of the upper terraces, barefoot, her royal robe brushed with ash and soil. Dust clung to her skin. Her eyes scanned the landscape, where once stood fountains and groves, staircases winding through hanging vines, and water lilies floating in carved marble pools. Now the pools were cracked, the lilies were gone. Cedar beams lay split and shattered. Soil poured from broken planters like spilled wine. And yet, in the very center of the ruin, between two fallen arches, the sapling still stood. She stepped toward it slowly. It was small, only a few hands high. Its leaves trembled in the morning air, catching the first gold of sunrise. Around it, the stone had collapsed just narrowly, as though the ruin itself had bent to avoid it. Amethyst knelt and touched its slender trunk, still firm, still green. She smiled through her tears. Nabu had seen to that. He emerged minutes later from below, covered in dust and bruises. Limping slightly, Amethyst looked up and saw him approach, his expression unreadable. Behind him came Kalamu and two workers bearing lanterns, their faces pale, their hands blackened with soot and soil. "No deaths," Nabu said before she could ask. "The workers made it out. Some are injured, but no lives were lost." Amethyst nodded, still kneeling. "But the garden lives in this," he said, stepping beside her and kneeling as well. They both looked at the sapling in silence. Then he added, "I placed stones around it last week, just enough to deflect the weight if the vault failed." "You knew it would fall." "I knew it might." She looked at him fully now. His face had changed. Thinner, sharper, his hair matted with dust, his eyes lined with exhaustion. But there was something clearer there too. Relief. He had carried the garden for so long, its weight on his shoulders, its survival in his calculations. Now, finally, it had fallen, not to destroy, but to rest. And in that rest, something new had begun. Elsewhere in the city, the temple bells rang, not in mourning, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. High Priestess Shara stood at the altar of Ishtar, surrounded by scribes and nobles as she addressed the people gathered in the temple courtyard. "The gods have taken back the sky," she proclaimed, "and in return, they have left us the seed of wisdom." Her words echoed through the marble columns. Let no one say the garden was a mistake. Let no one say it was vanity. It was love, grown too tall. And now it sleeps beneath the earth, where roots belong. The crowd murmured. Some bowed their heads. Others looked toward the distant terraces, now visibly cracked from afar. No flames rose from them, no smoke, only dust and quiet. The kind of quiet left behind after something beautiful sighs its last breath. Kidratu spent the next 3 days recording everything. He walked through every surviving path, sketched each collapsed arch and broken beam, noted each shift in stone and soil. He wrote of the final descent, of the silence afterward, of the queen kneeling in the dust, beside a sprout no taller than her hand. He recorded the engineers' efforts, the priests' warnings, the people's awe and their fear. But he also recorded something else, something invisible, the mood of the city. The people walk more slowly now, he wrote, not from grief, but from reverence. They whisper their words. They pause before the gates. Even the children play more gently, as though they understand something has changed. He closed his scroll with a final line. The hanging gardens have fallen, but Babylon has grown taller. Nabu remained near the terraces, sleeping in a canvas tent set beside the third level's central column. He refused the palace's offer to return to his chambers. He declined the physicians. He rarely spoke, except to give instructions to his workers. He was not grieving. He was waiting. For the collapse had not ended all. The lower terraces still stood, less strained, less damaged, their vaults still intact. Much of the irrigation system remained. Dozens of trees had survived. The figs and olives had fallen, yes, but the roots still lived. The soil could be restored, and the sapling, her sapling, could be protected. He gathered his apprentices and the most loyal laborers. "We build again," he said, voice hoarse. Kalamu blinked. "Rebuild the garden?" "No," Nabu said, standing before them, his shadow long in the morning light. "We build its heart. We let it grow from the inside. No more scaffolding, no more sky-reaching. This time, we let it grow like a tree, not a tower." He turned his gaze upward toward the sky that had once seemed so reachable. "No more war against gravity," he said. "Now we plant peace." Amatis walked the city more frequently in the weeks that followed. Not in a gilded chariot, not surrounded by guards. She walked on foot, her robes plain, her sandals dusty. She spoke with bakers and farmers, asked questions at the marketplace, offered coins to weavers. The people no longer bowed in her presence. They simply nodded, as if to one of their own. She became a symbol, not of royalty, but of remembrance. The woman who touched the heavens and brought back a tree. Children began playing games around the base of the garden. They called the surviving trees the sleeping forest. Poets sang of the wind's mercy. Craftsmen carved miniatures of the terraces as they once were. Priests no longer spoke of wrath, but of patience. And from the sapling, the first tiny leaf unfurled into the sun. It took a year to stabilize the structure, another to remove the highest ruins. During that time, Amatis often sat beside the sapling in the early mornings, her hands in the dirt, her eyes closed, listening to the wind. Sometimes Nabu joined her, sometimes not. One morning, she found a small tablet resting beside the roots. It was simple, unmarked. She turned it over and found a single line carved in clean, sure script. "Let what falls become seed." She smiled and buried it beneath the soil. The hanging gardens would never be the same. They would not tower again. They would not dazzle with impossible height. They would not trick the eye into believing the earth had grown skyward. Instead, they became a sanctuary. Stone paths wove between trees, allowed to grow naturally. Terraces were leveled for strength, not spectacle. Vines grew wild along carved steps. Pools were shallow but clear. The sky above was unobstructed. Birdsong returned. So did the bees. And one day, a single fig, large and purple, fell gently from the tree, grown from Amatis's hands. She bit into it and smiled. In later years, travelers still came to Babylon in search of the legendary garden. They expected towers. What they found was peace, a living grove, a sanctuary built upon ruin. Stone shaped not to dominate nature, but to embrace it. And in the center of it all stood a queen, older now, hands dirty with soil, eyes bright with memory. When asked what became of the hanging gardens of Babylon, she would simply gesture to the trees and say, "It did not fall. It changed shape. It is still hanging, just lower now." And when they asked what its true name was, she whispered, "Eden." Time passed, and the ruins settled, not just into the earth, but into the memory of a city that had learned to live without looking up. Where once the hanging gardens had risen in defiance of nature, the new garden unfolded in rhythm with it. The symmetry of arches and aqueducts gave way to the organic curve of roots, branches, and wind-worn stone. Ivy crept unbothered over once polished bricks. Birds nested in columns that had once supported fountains. Moss softened the cracks. What remained of the structure stood not as a monument, but as a living place. Not a place to marvel, but a place to breathe. They called it many things. The lower garden, the roots of the queen, the quiet grove. But among those who remembered the past, who had seen its heights, walked its impossible staircases, bathed in the shadow of hanging cedar groves, it was simply the garden after. Nabu had changed. Where once he walked with tools and calculations in hand, now he walked barefoot with a small spade and a sack of seeds. His days were no longer governed by geometry and pressure thresholds, but by seasons and sunlight. He rose with the birds, followed the shadow paths across the garden floor, and sat by the small streams he had once designed as overflow channels, now gently overgrown, transformed into living brooks. People still came to ask his advice. Artisans, gardeners, scholars. The king's engineers still offered him marble and labor, but he turned most of them away. He had no more plans to build, only to plant. Amatus visited him often, sometimes with a fig or a pomegranate from the surviving trees, sometimes with nothing but silence. Their conversations were quiet now. They rarely spoke of what was lost. They tended to what remained, watering the almond tree by the broken arch, pruning the date palm that leaned over the reflecting pool, chasing beetles from the lotus beds. Once, as they knelt side by side among the herbs, Amatus said, "Do you ever hear it?" Nabu looked at her. "Hear what?" "The way it used to sound. The water above, the vines in the wind, the staircases, breathing." He looked out over the rewilded terraces. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but mostly, I hear what it is now." She smiled. "What is that?" He paused. "Alive." The city of Babylon adjusted, as cities do. The merchants sold new talismans, carved wood instead of gold, greenstone instead of lapis. Pilgrims came, not to see a wonder of the world, but to sit beneath the fig tree grown from the queen's own hands. They left offerings of water and seed. Some knelt, others simply listened. It became a place of reflection, a place for questions, a place for those who no longer believed in towers. High Priestess Shara walked the garden in silence now. Older, her hair silver beneath her indigo veil, she often stood by the remains of the central basin, now converted into a shallow pond lined with lilies. She never spoke of the fall. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. One morning, Amatus found her kneeling beside the sapling, now grown into a young tree. The queen approached, offering a cup of cool water. Shara accepted it wordlessly and poured it at the roots. Then she looked up and said, "I thought this place would become a grave." Amatus knelt beside her. "And now?" Shara touched the tree. "Now, I think it's a doorway." Kidratu, the scribe, continued writing, but his tone had changed. His scrolls no longer described blueprints or palace decrees. He no longer detailed terrace dimensions or marble quantities. Now, he wrote stories, tales of the garden told by children, memories shared by elders, the dreams of gardeners who claimed they had spoken to trees in sleep. He recorded rumors, poetry, and prayers. His most treasured scroll he titled simply, "After the Hanging." In it, he wrote, "There are wonders that rise and wonders that remain, but the truest wonder is the one that grows again." The king grew old. Nebuchadnezzar no longer visited the terraces. His knees ached. His mind wandered. He spent his days in the Hall of Lions, dictating laws, answering emissaries, and watching the sun cross the sky as though it too were one of his subjects. But one day, near the end of summer, he asked to be taken to the garden. A litter was prepared. Guards and attendants followed at a respectful distance. The king was carried through the western entrance, where the staircases were still intact. It had been nearly 5 years since he last climbed them. When he reached the main terrace, the fig trees bowed slightly in the wind. The bees hummed lazily through the lavender. The sky above was open, unblocked, clean, vast, and he wept. He asked for Amatis. She came quickly. They sat side by side beneath the central tree. He reached out and touched the bark with one trembling hand. "It lived," he whispered. "You were right." Amatis took his hand gently. "Not just lived, it changed." He looked at her. "So must we." The king died in the winter that followed. No great monument was built for him. By his final request, his ashes were scattered into the upper garden pond, where lotus now grew. Amatis poured the final handful herself, letting the wind carry the rest. The people mourned him, but the city did not weep long. Spring was coming. And with spring came children, dozens of them racing through the garden paths, their feet kicking up soil, their laughter bouncing from stone to leaf. The garden, once sacred, had become safe, playful, joyful. Amitis stood at the entrance one morning, watching a girl no older than 6 lean down to press her ear to the base of the queen's tree. "What do you hear?" she asked. The girl looked up with a serious face and said, "The tree says it misses the sky." Amitis knelt. "And what did you say?" "I told it the sky is still there," the girl said. "Just closer now." Years passed. The garden changed. Again. Not dramatically, but slowly, as all living things do. New trees were planted, not by architects, but by children and farmers. The old stone staircases were softened by vines. Moss covered the ancient bricks. A willow grew where once the upper basin cracked. The queen walked less now. Her hair silvered, her hands ached, but she still came to sit by the pond, to run her fingers through the water, to speak to the tree that had grown from her last great hope. One day, she found Nabu waiting for her there. He looked older too, but his eyes remained sharp, clear. "I have something for you," he said, and handed her a small tablet carved from clay. She turned it over. The words were simple. "Nothing reaches the heavens unless it grows." Amitis smiled. "It was never meant to hang," she said, "only to root." They sat in silence. The wind moved through the leaves above them, and the tree rustled gently, neither in mourning nor in triumph, but simply being. A breath, a continuation, a promise. The years had folded softly over Babylon like a gentle cloak. The city grew older, wiser, carrying the scars of its past with dignity rather than fear. Where once the hanging gardens soared proudly above the Euphrates, now a green sanctuary thrived beneath the open sky, the garden that had changed shape. At the heart of this transformed paradise stood a great tree. Its trunk was thick, gnarled, and ancient-looking, though in truth it was little more than a few decades old. To the people of Babylon, however, it was more than just a tree. It was the memory tree. It grew from the seed Amitis had planted on that day long ago, a seed born of love and hope, nurtured by devotion and resilience. The tree had witnessed the fall of the terraces, the silent mourning of a city, the renewal of a sacred promise, and it bore witness still. Amitis sat beneath the sprawling branches of the memory tree, her fingers gently tracing the grooves in its bark. Her hair, silver now, was tucked beneath a simple veil. Her eyes, though dimmed by time, held the spark of a woman who had loved deeply and lost with grace. Around her, children played. Their laughter was light, ringing through the garden like the soft chime of temple bells. They darted between the roots of the tree, climbed the low branches, and imagined tales that would one day be woven into the tapestry of Babylon's history. A small boy approached her, carefully, clutching a clay tablet carved with symbols. He handed it to her and said, "I want to tell the story of the garden, Queen Amitis." She smiled warmly. "Then tell me," she said. He settled at her feet and began. "In the beginning," he said, "the garden hung high above the city like the god's own palace. It was made of stone and water and trees, a miracle born from a king's love for his queen." Amitis nodded. "And what came next?" "The garden grew heavy," he continued, "and the stone beneath could not hold it forever. The terraces fell, but the queen planted a seed, and from that seed grew the memory tree." The queen's eyes glistened with tears. "Very good," she whispered. "You are a true storyteller." He grinned, then scampered off to join the others. Meanwhile, Nabu stood a few paces away, leaning on his cane as he surveyed the garden. His once dark hair was now silver like Amitis's, and his hands trembled slightly with age. But his eyes, sharp as ever, remained fixed on the memory tree. He recalled the years they had spent working beneath the terraces, those long days and nights spent ensuring that the garden would not fall outward onto the city below, that the collapse would be a controlled descent rather than a ruinous disaster. He remembered the moments of despair and hope, the silent prayers, the labor of countless hands, and now, seeing the tree standing tall, vibrant, and alive, he felt a quiet peace. A young woman approached him, a gardener apprentice named Salima, eager and earnest. "Master Nabu," she said, "how do we make sure the garden lives on for 1,000 years?" Nabu smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "By remembering," he said, "by telling its story, by planting not just trees, but ideas and dreams. The garden is not just in stone or soil, it is in the hearts of those who love it." Salima nodded thoughtfully. "Then I will teach everyone I meet." "You will?" he said with certainty. In the city beyond the garden walls, the priests prepared for a new festival, one not of war or conquest, but of renewal and peace. It was called the Festival of the Memory Tree. Every year, on the day when the first seed was planted, the people gathered beneath the sprawling branches to give thanks for endurance and transformation. Songs were sung, dances performed, and offerings made, not of gold or precious stones, but of fruit, flowers, and freshly tilled earth. Amatis was honored each year as the garden's guardian and storyteller. Though her health waned, her spirit never dimmed. She taught the children the old tales and whispered to the trees, reminding them of their place in the endless cycle of life. One evening during the festival, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amatis stood before the gathered crowd. Her voice was soft but clear. "The hanging gardens were not just a wonder of stone and water," she said. "They were a promise that even when great things fall, they can rise again, transformed and renewed." The crowd listened in silence, feeling the weight and warmth of her words. "Let this tree remind us," she continued, "that memory is not only of what was, but of what can be, that every ending carries within it the seed of a new beginning." The people cheered, their voices lifting into the starry night. Years later, after Amatis passed, the garden continued to thrive. The memory tree grew ever larger, its branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. Travelers from distant lands came to see it, to hear the stories of the queen who loved too much, the engineer who built with heart, and the city that embraced change rather than fear it. And as the centuries rolled forward, the memory tree became a symbol, not just of Babylon, but of all who dared to dream beyond the limits of stone and sky. It whispered to the wind, carried songs across the desert, and cradled the memories of a garden that had once hung between earth and heaven. A garden that, though changed, would never be forgotten. The memory tree's leaves whispered in the breeze, a soft murmur woven with ancient voices and new ones alike. Beneath its broad canopy, generations gathered, storytellers, dreamers, laborers, and children, all drawn together by the invisible threads of history, memory, and hope. The garden had become more than a place. It was a living archive. Every root, every leaf held stories, some joyful, some sorrowful, told and retold beneath the branches where sunlight filtered like liquid gold. One afternoon, a traveling scholar arrived in Babylon. His name was Ardashir, and he carried scrolls bound with blue thread and a heart hungry for knowledge. Word of the memory tree had reached far beyond the city walls, and he came seeking the stories buried beneath the leaves. Ardashir approached the garden gates as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over cracked stones, softened by moss and ivy. He paused, feeling the weight of centuries in the air, then stepped inside. The scent of jasmine and fig filled his senses, mingling with the faint hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. The garden was alive, a sanctuary not of marble or gold, but of green and growth. Guided by villagers, he found himself beneath the memory tree, where Amatis's descendants and apprentices gathered. An elderly woman sat near the tree's trunk, her hands weathered but gentle, her eyes bright with stories. She was Salima, the apprentice who had once learned from Nabu himself. Seeing the scholar, Salima smiled. "Welcome, traveler," she said. "You seek the voices beneath the leaves." Ardashir nodded. "Then listen closely," she said, "for the garden speaks not with words, but with memory." Salima began to recount the old tales, stories passed down like sacred gifts. She spoke of the king who built the garden to honor his queen's longing for the green hills of Media. She spoke of the engineers who defied gravity and stone, crafting terraces that seemed to float. She spoke of the night the garden fell, not in ruin, but with the grace of a sleeping giant. And she spoke of the seed that survived, growing into the memory tree, the heart of the garden that refused to die. As she spoke, others joined. A poet recited verses praising resilience. A farmer shared wisdom on nurturing new growth. A child recounted the legend of the fig that bore the city's hopes. Ardashir listened, captivated. But he was also a scholar of facts and records. He asked questions. "How do you know these stories?" Salima's eyes twinkled. "Because we live them. Because the garden is not just stone and soil, but people." "Is there a record, a written scroll?" "Many," she said, "but the truest records are in the leaves, the roots, the wind." That night, Ardashir camped beneath the memory tree. The stars wheeled overhead as the garden breathed around him, alive with the quiet songs of cicadas and the rustling of ancient branches. In his dreams he heard whispers, voices of the past, a child laughing, the splash of water, a queen's gentle sigh, an engineer's steady breath. He awoke with the dawn, determined to capture not only the garden's history, but its spirit. Over the following months, Ardashir became part of the garden's life. He helped tend the herbs, listened to stories from the villagers, and recorded tales on fresh scrolls. One day, as he walked the pathways, he found a hidden alcove beneath the ruins of a collapsed terrace. There, engraved in stone, was a message. "Let this garden be a bridge between earth and sky, past and future, memory and hope." He traced the words with his fingers, feeling a profound connection to those who had built and rebuilt this place. He realized that the garden's true wonder was not in its height or grandeur, but in its endurance and transformation. News of Ardashir's work spread through Babylon. Scholars, poets, and travelers came to learn from the garden's stories. The memory tree became a gathering place for debates about nature, history, and the meaning of beauty. Some argued that the garden's fall was a failure, others that it was a triumph of humility. But all agreed on one thing: the garden was alive. One evening, during a festival celebrating the garden's anniversary, Ardashir stood before the crowd beneath the memory tree. He raised his voice so all could hear. "This garden teaches us that nothing is permanent, not even wonders. Yet within change lies the power to endure. The hanging gardens of Babylon do not simply exist in stone and water, but in the hearts of those who remember and tend them. May we carry their story forward, as leaves carried by the wind." The crowd erupted in applause. Children danced among the roots, elders nodded in approval, and the garden seemed to glow under the moonlight. As the years passed, the garden continued to inspire. Its stories spread beyond Babylon, carried by travelers and scribes. The memory tree became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the mightiest marvels must one day yield to time. But from their fall, new life can rise. And beneath the vast sky, the garden whispered its eternal song. The sun cast long shadows over the garden, gilding the stone pathways with warm light. The memory tree stood tall and proud, its branches swaying gently in the desert breeze, carrying the stories of countless seasons within their leaves. In the shade beneath its sprawling canopy, a young woman named Layla prepared for her new role, the keeper of the garden. She was chosen by the elders not because of royal blood or scholarly knowledge, but for her deep love of the garden and her unyielding commitment to protect its legacy. Layla understood the weight of the promise she was about to make. The day began with a ceremony. Villagers and visitors gathered beneath the memory tree, their faces bright with anticipation and respect. Elders spoke of the garden's origins, of its fall and rebirth, and of the sacred trust passed from generation to generation. Then, the high priestess approached Layla with a small wooden box. Inside lay a simple but beautiful amulet, carved from cedar wood and inlaid with lapis lazuli. This, the priestess said, is the keeper's amulet. It symbolizes the bond between the garden, its people, and the promise to nurture what lives here, both seen and unseen. Layla accepted the amulet with trembling hands. She placed it around her neck, feeling the cool weight settle over her heart. From that moment, Layla's days were filled with new purpose. She learned the ancient irrigation channels, studied the cycles of water and soil, and tended the delicate balance between nature and stone. She walked the garden paths daily, greeting every tree and flower as if they were old friends. But the garden was more than plants and stones. It was a living memory, a fragile thread woven through time. Layla knew she was not only caring for the garden's present, but safeguarding its future. One morning, as Layla watered the young fig saplings near the base of the memory tree, she noticed a stranger approaching. He was a tall man, dressed in the simple robes of a scholar, his eyes filled with curiosity and reverence. "Greetings," he said softly. "I am Darius, a traveler and student of histories. I have heard tales of the hanging gardens and the memory tree. May I learn from you?" Layla smiled and nodded. "Welcome to the garden, Darius. Here, every leaf tells a story. But more than that, this place teaches us to listen to the earth, to the wind, and to each other." Darius spent the day walking the garden with Layla, asking questions and sharing stories from lands beyond Babylon. They spoke of empires, risen and fallen, of wonders built and lost, and of the enduring power of memory. As days turned to weeks, Layla and Darius grew close. Together they worked to restore forgotten paths, plant new trees, and gather stories from the villagers. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Layla confided in Darius. "I sometimes fear," she said quietly, "that the garden's story will fade with us, that one day no one will remember the promises made beneath this tree." Darius took her hand gently. "The garden's roots run deep, Layla," he said, "and as long as we tell its story, it will never be forgotten." She smiled, feeling hope bloom within her heart, like the flowers she tended. But the garden faced challenges. The city of Babylon grew busier, its streets filled with merchants, soldiers, and travelers. The demands of progress threatened to overshadow the quiet sanctuary. One day, Layla discovered that a group of builders planned to construct a new market near the garden's edge, an expansion that risked damaging the delicate irrigation system and the ancient stonework. She rushed to the city council, pleading for protection. "The garden is more than a place of beauty," she said passionately. It is our history, our heritage. If we lose it, we lose a part of ourselves. Some council members listened. Others dismissed her concerns. The debate grew heated. Determined, Layla turned to the villagers and scholars who had gathered over the years. Together, they organized a festival to celebrate the garden's importance, a day filled with music, dance, poetry, and offerings. The event drew attention far beyond Babylon, inspiring letters from distant rulers and scholars who praised the garden's legacy. Faced with growing support, the council agreed to designate the garden and its surroundings as a protected sanctuary. The builders withdrew their plans. With the garden safe, Layla continued her work, guided by the keeper's promise to honor the past, nurture the present, and plant seeds for the future. Under the memory tree's shade, she taught children to listen to the wind, to care for the earth, and to tell the stories that give meaning to life. She reminded them that the hanging gardens were not just a monument of stone and water, but a living testament to resilience, love, and transformation. And in every leaf that fluttered above her, she heard the echo of promises made long ago. The garden, nestled beneath the open sky, seemed to hold its breath each dawn, as if listening for voices carried on the wind. Voices from the past, long buried but never truly silent. Layla stood at the edge of the ancient terraces, watching shadows stretch across moss-covered stones. She often found herself drawn to this quiet place, where the whispers of time mingled with the rustle of leaves. This morning, the air was thick with a curious energy, an anticipation she could not name. As the sun rose higher, a stranger arrived, an old man with eyes like polished amber and a gait that spoke of journeys far and wide. He introduced himself simply as Erish, a traveler from the eastern deserts, seeking the stories hidden beneath Babylon's green heart. Layla welcomed him, sensing that he carried more than just curiosity. There was wisdom etched into the lines of his face, and a quiet sorrow in his gaze. Together, they wandered through the garden, stepping lightly over roots and stone. Erish paused beneath the memory tree, running his fingers along the bark, as if reading an ancient script. "Do you hear them?" he asked softly. "Hear what?" Layla replied. "The whispers," Erish said, closing his eyes. "The voices of those who built this place, their hopes, fears, dreams." Layla smiled. "Sometimes," she said, "if you listen closely, the garden speaks." Erish shared stories of his travels, tales of lost cities swallowed by sand, of temples abandoned to time, of gardens that once bloomed and vanished without trace. He spoke of the fragility of memory and the resilience of those who carry it. In every leaf, he said, there is a story waiting to be told. In every root, a secret kept safe. Layla felt a stirring deep within her, a call to preserve not just the garden's beauty, but its voice. Together they devised a plan to gather the stories of Babylon's people, the voices that shaped the garden's living memory. Over the weeks that followed, Layla and Erish traveled beyond the city, visiting villages, listening to elders, and recording tales passed down through generations. They discovered stories of lovers reunited beneath the fig trees, of warriors who found peace in the garden's shade, of children who dreamed of stars while lying on soft moss. Each tale added a thread to the garden's tapestry, weaving past and present into a living history. Back in Babylon, Layla organized gatherings beneath the memory tree, where people shared their memories and dreams. The garden became a sanctuary, not only for plants, but for voices, a place where the past whispered gently to the future. One evening, during a gathering lit by lanterns and stars, an elder named Ninsun stood before the crowd. She spoke of her youth, when the garden was still new and the terraces reached toward the sky. She told of Queen Ametis, whose love had sparked the garden's creation, and of Nabu, the engineer who had nurtured it through collapse and renewal. Her voice trembled as she recalled the fall of the terraces, the silence that followed, and the fragile sapling that had survived. But, Ninsun said, the garden's true strength lies not in its stones, but in the memories we carry. As long as we remember, the garden lives. The crowd nodded, eyes shining with shared reverence. Eresh and Layla worked to compile these stories into scrolls, a living archive called The Voices Beneath the Leaves. They invited scribes and poets to help preserve the garden's heritage, ensuring that its whispers would reach far beyond Babylon. The scrolls were kept in the temple library and shared with travelers who promised to carry the stories across the lands. In this way, the garden's voice grew louder, its story spreading like the branches of the memory tree. As seasons changed, Layla noticed a new growth near the garden's center, a small shoot pushing through cracked stone. She knelt beside it, brushing soil away to reveal a delicate sprout. "It is a sign," she whispered to Eresh, "that even after centuries, life continues to grow." Eresh nodded, eyes reflecting the green promise. "From whispers to roots," he said. "The garden's story never ends." The memory tree continued to stand, a sentinel of time, witness to the enduring power of memory and renewal. And beneath its branches, the voices of the past and present blended into a song carried by the wind, eternal and ever-changing. The garden had become a living heart at the center of Babylon, a sanctuary where the past intertwined with the present and stretched its branches toward the future. The memory tree, mighty and sprawling, cast its generous shade across the garden paths, sheltering both the flowers that bloomed and the stories that flourished within its leaves. Layla stood in the soft morning light, her fingers lightly brushing the budding leaves of a young fig sapling recently planted at the garden's edge. Around her, children knelt on the warm earth, their small hands gently pressing the roots of saplings into the rich, dark soil. Their faces were full of wonder and seriousness, as if the act of planting was a sacred ritual passed down from the very hands of Ametis and Nabu. A little boy named Sammy looked up, his wide eyes sparkling with curiosity as he tugged at Layla's sleeve. "Why do we plant these trees, Keeper Layla? Will they grow tall like the memory tree?" Layla smiled softly and knelt to meet his gaze. "Yes, Sammy. Each tree we plant is a seed of tomorrow. It holds hope, stories, and life within it. Just like the memory tree grew from a small seed, so too can these saplings grow into something magnificent. But it takes patience, care, and love." Sammy nodded solemnly, and the other children returned to their work with renewed energy, digging their hands deeper into the earth and whispering promises to the young plants. The morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the children's faces with light, and the garden hummed softly, alive with bees, the scent of blooming jasmine, and the faint murmur of water trickling through the ancient irrigation channels. Meanwhile, in the heart of the garden, Darius and Eresh pored over scrolls spread across a low wooden table. They were scribes and scholars of a different kind, storytellers weaving together the garden's past and future through words. "Each story," Darius said thoughtfully, "is like a seed itself. Some will grow into poems, some into lessons, and some into legends. Our task is to tend them carefully so they can take root in the hearts of those who come after us." Eresh nodded, his amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lanterns around them. "We must remember that the garden is not merely stone and water. It is the lives, hopes, and memories of the people who have walked these paths. Our scrolls should capture that, the spirit as much as the history." Together, they labored late into the night, inscribing tales of the king's love for his queen, the brilliance of Nabu's engineering, the tragedy of the terrace's fall, and the quiet resilience of the memory tree that rose from the ruins. They collected stories from the villagers, an old woman's memories of sitting beneath the garden's shade as a child, a farmer's account of the first harvest of dates from the restored palm trees, a child's fanciful tale of the garden's vines whispering secrets to the stars. All these voices found their way into the scrolls, living words for living trees. As the city of Babylon bustled beyond the garden walls, the council was stirred by these stories and the passion of the people. Encouraged by Layla's unwavering dedication and the growing chorus of voices who understood the garden's sacred value, the council convened to debate the future of Babylon's green spaces. At first, some members argued for expanding markets and roads, seeing progress in stone and commerce, but others, inspired by the garden's enduring spirit, argued for balance, reminding the council that the garden was not only a treasure of the past, but a vital wellspring for the city's soul. Layla stood before the council one day, her voice steady and clear. The hanging gardens teach us that greatness is not just built, but nurtured. If we lose this garden, we lose the roots that hold Babylon together. Protecting it means protecting our history, our culture, and our future. The council, moved by her plea and the community's support, passed new laws protecting the garden and encouraging the planting of green spaces throughout Babylon. These laws spurred a renaissance of gardens, from simple courtyard plots tended by families to grand terraces atop public buildings. Artisans crafted mosaics depicting the memory tree and the hanging terraces, displaying them in marketplaces and temples as symbols of resilience and renewal. Layla's days grew busier with the arrival of young apprentices eager to learn the keeper's art. She taught them how to read the land's subtle signs, how to tend to delicate roots, and most importantly, how to listen. The garden speaks in quiet ways, she told them, in the rustle of leaves, the patterns of water, the way the earth crumbles beneath your fingers. If you listen, you can hear its stories. She led the apprentices through the labyrinth of terraces, past pools where lotus flowers floated, and along shaded walkways lined with pomegranate and olive trees. Together, they planted new trees, cypresses, palms, and fig trees, each a promise to the future. The apprentices learned that their role was not only to care for plants, but to nurture the garden's legacy, to be the keepers of its story. One bright morning, a delegation arrived from a distant kingdom, their camels laden with gifts, rare seeds from mountain valleys, delicate tools crafted from bronze and ivory, and scrolls filled with garden stories from their own lands. The delegation sought to learn from Babylon's wisdom and to create gardens that would flourish beyond the desert. Layla welcomed them with open arms, sharing the story of the hanging gardens and the memory tree. She showed them the irrigation channels that still carried water from the Euphrates, the terraces where ancient trees had taken root anew, and the scrolls chronicling the garden's transformation. The visitors marveled at the garden's beauty and resilience, promising to carry its spirit back to their kingdoms. They exchanged knowledge, sharing tales of mountains and rivers, of seeds and soil, weaving a web of connection that stretched beyond the Babylon's walls. As twilight descended on the garden, Layla stood beneath the memory tree, its branches glowing softly in the golden light. Darius and Eresh joined her, their faces reflecting the serenity of the moment. Together they contemplated the future, uncertain but full of promise. "We plant these seeds," Layla said softly, not knowing which will grow tall, but trusting that some will. That's the heart of hope. Darius nodded. And those that do grow will carry our stories, our love, and our lessons forward. Eresh smiled, tracing the memory tree's bark with reverence. The garden's story is endless, like the roots beneath the earth, reaching deeper with every generation. As night wrapped the garden in a cloak of stars, the memory tree whispered with the wind, a timeless song of life, loss, and rebirth. The garden breathed quietly, alive with the memories of those who had loved it and the promise of those who would nurture it still. And beneath its branches, the people of Babylon dreamed of gardens yet to grow, of stories yet to be told, and of a world forever rooted in hope. The sun rose over Babylon, casting a golden glow across the city and the garden that had stood witness to centuries of change. The memory tree stretched its mighty branches into the sky, as if reaching to touch the heavens themselves. Beneath its shade, the garden flourished, alive, breathing, eternal. Layla, now aged and wise, walked slowly along the winding paths, her eyes resting fondly on the trees and flowers that had grown under her care. Around her, the next generation of keepers tended the plants with gentle hands and eager hearts. The garden was no longer just a place of beauty, it was a living testament, a promise made long ago that life and memory would endure beyond stone and time. Today was a day of celebration. The city had gathered to honor the garden's legacy and the keepers who had preserved it through trials and triumphs. Music and laughter filled the air, mingling with the scent of jasmine and fresh earth. Layla sat beneath the memory tree, her silver hair catching the sunlight, a soft smile upon her lips. Around her were children and elders, scholars and travelers, all united by the stories the garden held. She felt a gentle hand on her own and turned to see Darius, his eyes warm with friendship and respect. "We have come far," he said quietly. Layla nodded. From a single seed, a forest grows. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Layla stood and addressed the gathering. Long ago, this garden was born from love, a king's love for his queen, a city's hope for beauty, in a harsh land, she said. It rose high, a wonder to the world. Then it fell, humbled by time and fate. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But from that fall, life found a way to grow anew. The memory tree and this garden remind us that true strength is not in grandeur, but in resilience, in the roots that hold firm beneath the earth, in the stories that live in our hearts. The crowd listened in reverent silence. In the twilight, a breeze stirred the leaves above, carrying with it whispers, echoes of voices long gone, but never forgotten. Amytis' laughter, soft as a breeze through figs. Nabu's steady footsteps on stone terraces. The king's hopeful gaze to the horizon. And the countless voices of those who had loved and nurtured the garden through the ages. Layla closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the connection between past and present, between earth and sky. As night enveloped Babylon, stars twinkled overhead, reflected in the pools and leaves of the garden. Layla sat beneath the memory tree, surrounded by the new keepers, young women and men ready to carry the promise forward. She handed each one a small cedar seed, polished smooth and inscribed with ancient symbols. "Plant these," she said softly, "and remember, the garden is not just a place, it is a living story. You are its roots, its branches, and its future." The keepers accepted the seeds with solemn gratitude. Years would pass, as they always do. The garden would continue to change, its terraces softened by time, its waters flowing in new patterns, its trees reaching ever higher, But the spirit of the Hanging Gardens, born of love, loss, and hope, would live on, in the stories told beneath the memory tree, in the hands that nurtured each sapling, in the hearts of the people who understood that even the greatest wonders must one day surrender to time, only to rise again, transformed and eternal. And so the garden's roots stretched deep, eternal, forever entwined with the earth and the sky, a living promise that no matter what falls, life will grow again.